Greetings everybody and welcome to the show. Today we rejoin the Temple of Ra and Kemetic Temple of San Jose for the second part of this interview with key figures and authors of the contemporary Kemetic Reconstructionist movement in the West. Be sure to check out part 1 if you haven't yet. I first encountered the Temple of Ra through one of its founders, Richard Reedy, who was a participant in my PhD ethnography research, and he was so generous with his time and knowledge that we later became friends. Sadly, Richard passed away in 2015, but his legacy lives on in the form of a number of Egyptian Kemetic temples in the USA and 2 books on ancient Egyptian ritual practice. But what is Kemeticism? To put it simply, Kemeticism is the revival and/or reconstruction of ancient Egyptian religion and practices in the modern age. It crosses multiple boundaries of geography, ethnicity, and culture. But one thing they all tend to have in common is a reverence for the ancient Egyptian deities and desire to uphold Ma'at. That's the principle of truth, harmony, justice, and order named for the goddess Ma'at of ancient Egypt, or Kemet. As ever, a lot of the links and references that are thrown out during this discourse can be found in the show notes. But for now, relax, grab a cup of your favourite bevy, and settle in for this 2-part interview with members of these Kemetic temples. I was meeting professors in the corridor and we'd talk about the research and they'd say, oh yeah, but Egypt didn't really have a religion, did it? It was all just thermodynamics, essentially. It was all just for show. And I'm going, well, hang on a second, and that's why there's an entire chapter devoted to trying to find piety in the record.
Absolutely.
Because I think that's an important. But before we move on and before we go back onto that, I just wanted to ask you, Manu, because it sounds like you were on the verge of starting your own Kemetic religion back there for a while when you were having this very original thought, or so it seemed, in isolation to focus purely on the Egyptian gods. I'm just curious to know, before we move on, what would that have looked like to you moving forward had you not found the House of Necha online, which is the virtual presence of the Kemetic Orthodox Kemetic faith, for the listeners out there? What do you think that would have looked like? Do you think you would have gone into studying ancient Egyptian language, or just...
Oh, yes.
Yeah?
I was looking at it from a Reconstructionist point of view at that time, even though I didn't know what that term meant. Mm-hmm. I wanted something that was culturally focused. I wanted something that was historically authentic. And I probably would not have been able to come up with anything quite as eloquent as the rituals that Richard put together, but it would have been something along those lines.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I mean, there certainly seems to be a lot more in sync between what Egyptology is doing now and the focus of where it's going. Looking at the daily life and looking at how non-elites, shall we say, for ease of reference, were practicing religion. Matt, you want to jump in on that?
I was just basically saying, yes, I think there's actually great stuff happening, including some post-processual archaeological techniques, which are using experimental archaeology. Well, let's try making some of these potions, these remedies, these...
what a concept.
Let's try mummifying something. Well, that one's all over the news. Everybody knows about people trying to make mummies because that's, one of those ever fascinating topics. But there are other forms of experimental archaeology that are beginning to actually have a voice. And I know you've mentioned some of these in Profane Egyptologists. And I think it's growing. There's also a recognition, at least among some scholars, that there is something about modern day practitioners that is not, I'm trying to say this in a way that's diplomatic, that is not counter to the interests of academic Egyptology. It is true that not everyone who practices, and that sounds like a no true Scotsman kind of statement. I hope it's not taken too badly. Their Reconstructionist or revivalist style, which is what KO is, and they're very close in my mind together in some differences of style, but there's a lot of really similar goals. So I don't want to try to paint those two as big opposite poles on some sort of spectrum, but there are other parts of the New Age spiritual spectrums, the more general pagan religious spectrums that are rather different. And pyramidology, let's use pyramidology as one, which is pretty out there in my personal opinion, because it's not founded on anything that I can tell. There are serious practitioners doing this religious work who are also doing actual scholarship. And that, I think, and they're contributing something. They're contributing a set of viewpoints. And if you want to say it in a more buzzwordy kind of way, in a way we are doing experimental archaeology. We are performing the rituals. We're doing performance practice. And performance practice is done right this moment. There are some wonderful pieces where you find a schooled actor to then perform Sinue, which is a piece of, it's an Egyptian story, it's a piece of literature, it's one of the greatest pieces of literature of ancient Egypt. And with the help of an Egyptologist, the actor tells the story, and it will put goosebumps on you. It's wonderful because that actor, she can bring something out of the story that an academician reading will not do. She's a storyteller. She knows how to bring across emotions. She knows how to use all those bits of timing. And so I'll posit this question to the general world. How is it that what revivalists and reconstructionists are doing is not valuable in the same way, or a similar way? Not exactly the same way, a similar way. We're founding our material, our rituals on the very same sources that are being used for performance practice. Either some of it's also theatrical, in the very few cases where we have some theatrical Egyptian texts. And more than once it's been done with poetry and short stories.
And we're highly aware that we are not ancient Egyptians. We never will be ancient Egyptians. We are viewing ancient Egypt through the lens of our own culture, the same as Egyptologists are today. And we base much of our information on what Egyptologists have learned. So Egyptologists are a little bit ahead of us in that way, but it's kind of a symbiotic relationship, I believe, that we learn from the Egyptologists and we take that into our practice. And you never know where you might find something valuable. I will read, like you were talking about the interest in daily life. I'm very interested in daily life, and I will read any article that comes across my desk that is involved with that. I'm currently reading one by Sweeney, Family Gods at Deir el Medina, which is tracking the piety of three main families through several generations to see how the objects that they created, the votive objects that they created, do they reflect similar gods? Do they always reflect the same gods? Was each generation free to choose their own favorite gods? And that's not immediately applicable to me, especially as I don't have any children. I don't plan on having any children. But as you read these things, you find treasures, things that you never expected to find. And I think that having another set of eyes combing through this material from a slightly different angle could be very useful. It's very helpful for all of us.
Absolutely, and I can see parallels to phenomenology, the archaeology of phenomenology, where archaeologists were, trying to recreate experience of the temple, experience of certain aspects of life of the ancient world. And because, unfortunately, Egyptology, to my mind, is behind other fields of archaeology in terms of theoretical framework, it's not something that's been practiced a great deal or experimented with in Egyptology yet. It seems like we're getting there now. But one of the things that, I've argued in the past is that the great value of building bridges and communicating with people who are living this ritual, recreating ritual, is that it's more than just a phenomenological reconstruction from, shall we say, an archaeological atheist or non-believer or someone of a different denomination or faith. Mm-hmm. You're not viewing it through, even though it's a slightly different cultural lens, being our Western cultural lens, you're still viewing it through the lens of belief, of faith. And that is I think the only real dividing line between what we're doing, in my opinion, in Egyptology and what, Kemetic practitioners and reconstructionists are doing in your work. So it would be, I think, maybe good to paint a picture for people in brief. We don't have to go into a lot of detail, but just what does the average week for a temple look like? What kind of rituals are you going through, and are you doing festival reconstruction rituals and things like that?
Right now, it's fair to say that our rituals happen on a less than monthly basis. Mm-hmm. When it's getting together. We had a terrible loss in the loss of Rich, and it's been a difficult one to recover from. And other exigencies also abound with with the recent history over the last couple of years. And we generally shoot for a ritual each month. Many times I can't do it because of my own academic work. There's sometimes simply not enough time to get it all arranged because I'm the host, and that will improve over time. And that's true of these two temples here. I want to say this between San José and Temple of Ra, and in a way the two have coalesced in this period a little bit, and then once we get maybe back some more stability, we might split back apart again, but it'll never be quite the same. So in terms of festivals, we do several main festivals a year in our practice. One of them is the New Year, one of them is the Festival of Osiris, one of them is the brilliant Festival of Lights of Neat, and the beautiful Feast of the Valley. Those are the four main ones. At times when we are meeting and it is a full moon, we may add the full moon ritual into the middle of our general rituals. There's generally a space for either magical actions of some kind, healings, that kind of stuff, or specific rituals of that moment, call it mini festivals, that we can put it right in the middle of our monthly practice, and we will do that when the timing is correct. So I think that's...
Did you mention the reconciliation of the brothers?
And reconciliation of the brother gods. Thank you, Banu. That's one more we do.
And we'll also do sometimes rituals that are just in honor of Sekhmet or in honor of Sobek, especially when one of our members writes a new ritual for a god or goddess that we haven't honored before. We will come together and put it through its paces. That's
true. And in fact, I should have mentioned one of the rites of passage for members of Temple of Ra and San Jose, and probably some of the others, I believe so, is Rich would have you write a new general ritual. Mine was for Patach.
Mine was for Bast.
And let's see, one member was for Sobek.
One for Aset.
One for Aset, yes, those are the ones I'm thinking of. I don't know of any more at the moment, but there probably are.
There's an interesting strand I want to pick up on here, which may be too obvious for us to see, but from standing here as an outsider, and I'm trying to distance myself from our conversation so that I can preempt the questions of listeners who haven't studied you guys for 10 years. This kind of practice strikes me as very different from magical practice or ritual practice that I had studied or encountered before, in that the ongoing theme is that these rituals are for gods. You're not doing spells for, say, if I were to open up a Wiccan spellbook, I might find half a dozen spells on fertility, on finding money, on luck. There seems to be a real shift in focus towards rituals serving gods rather than serving the self. Do you think that that's...
Well, ancient Egyptian word, one of the ancient Egyptian words for priest was hem, which means servant. And when we take on those roles, I don't consider myself to be a priestess. I am more of a lay person, but I will assume the role of a priestess when I attend temple meetings because that is what the community needs of me right now. So yes, the rituals are very much about serving the gods. It's not about what you get out of the ritual. It's not about getting a zing, as Richard would say. But it is about serving the gods and serving Ma'at and serving your community through serving the gods and Ma'at. But there are spaces in the ritual where we can stop and we can do magic, we can do Heka, or we can do meditations or prayer or whatever we need. And we will often do, for example, on our New Year's rituals, we will do protection magic for all of the members of the temple for the coming year.
Right, which is traditional, by the way. There are invocations for that that were done during the 5 intercalary days, the days just before the new year, which were seen as dangerous, quite dangerous. Yes, the Egyptians did a lot of magic. They did a lot of healing magic earlier. In fact, most of the magic we have in the earlier periods in Egypt is about healing in one way or another. Later in Greek times, there's all kinds of magic, and it was a kind of an explosion of cultural connections going on, and it's very, very rich in its own light. But our rituals don't focus on the Heka portion. The Heka portion can be part of them, or, Banu said it perfectly, it could be meditation. Often it can be healing. A person can actually say, this month I really would like to do a ritual for this god or goddess because I want to make a petition for my health about this. And they'll request it more or less. So we do
sometimes, like I remember there were a couple of times where Richard said to, for example, to Wepaway, I need the way open to me for this part of my life. And if you do this for me, then I will host a ritual for you. Yes. And Wepaway came through, and we did that ritual at a Pantheacon.
Yes, and that's great. And so we have that allows us a lot of flexible creativity, I think, in terms of ritual. So the ritual itself is for a god or goddess, or sometimes more than one. They can be communal. And then in the very last portion of it, after most of the service section is done, and by service I mean service to the god or goddess or set, then is a space, and that space can be used for these kinds of things. There's also more complex festival rituals that it's more interspersed than that.
If I could just move into a different area quickly, because I know we're kind of pushed for time. There's a broader Kemetic community, and there are many different branches of Kemetic practice. Don't worry, I'm not going to try and get you into a bazinga here. I'm not interested in causing flame wars.
No.
But you know, just to kind of paint a picture for people, like, do you feel that there are? I mean, let me start the ball rolling. Actually, one of the things I noticed when I first heard of the Temple of Ra and Kemetic Temple of San Jose was that there was virtually no online presence, and if one has looked at the time. And if one has looked into Kemeticism online over the past few years, they'll see that there is a very strong online presence of multiple temples. And some of those temples might not last very long, but there's usually that will be the seat of discussion or communication for some of these groups, or at least a strong reflection of the community online if they have a group that meets. So, I mean, was that intentional with Temple of Ra, that it didn't start as an online phenomenon? Or?
Rich did have some questions in his mind about the online world in general. However, we do have a web page. It's rather static right now, and we've tried to do some experiments more recently on having a forum style webpage that would be accessible both to insiders and outsiders, moderated forum. And that, unfortunately, has gone fallow for proper software, proper servers, and proper
tech support,
tech support and admin. And no one is quite in that position for us right this moment. We do have a Facebook group, but it's private because we tend to communicate within our own groups more, I think, than be a nexus for online.
Yeah, we have our own mailing list that involves all the people in the various different sister temples.
And so, yes, partially this is having the bandwidth to get the work done. From KemeticTemples.org, KemeticTemple.org, which is the web presence, you can actually get to me by email. You can get to High C by email, who is another person. I'm not sure.
My email has been removed.
Okay, so there's a few people you can get to directly, basically, depending on if you're interested in San Jose or you're interested in Temple of Ra, if you're interested in the Denver Temple, for example, Per Achet, you can get to them. And we will occasionally divvy up the emails. And so there are some connections to people who are outside. I have maintained a couple of contacts with people in other countries. However, that's extremely difficult in our particular situation. We are not focused on a web-style presence. It is an interpersonal presence in general.
Which leads quite nicely, actually, into my next question, and that's, is there much interaction between, the temples that have been set up here and the other temples in the Kemetic community outside of things like Pantheacon? Are there either personal or professional connections? I say professional, like Kemetic connections with any other temples that weren't satellites of the original?
I think that Pantheacon is our main point of contact in person. It's the only time that we actually get people together in physical space. But I have maintained friendly ties with many of the groups that I have passed through. And I do believe that maintaining those harmonious relationships is part of Ma'at. So I think that flame wars, as you mentioned earlier, are very detrimental to that. Yeah. And so I have done my best to avoid any of those and try to smooth them over if I see one brewing.
Let's see. In terms of our own groups, we do actually see each other kind of rarely, I suppose, if they're from out of state. The people from Sacramento will do their best to come for the New Year's, because that's one where we will try to get together in California space. The people from Denver have come to Pantheacon and will likely do again. And actually, I'm going to see a person from Denver Tuesday night, 2 days from now.
Awesome.
Because they're here for a conference. So that does happen. In terms of outside of our temple groups, I actually now have a friend who is a priestess in KO. I mean, an actual priestess in KO.
Like an imaku?
I don't know the titles.
I think that is the title, yeah.
Is it?
Yeah.
It might very well be.
Well, you would know.
It might very well be. I would not be surprised. In the state level somewhere.
Okay, cool.
And we get along famously.
I get along very well with people from Kemetic Orthodoxy and the Quetzalcoatl and all the various different... we're all Kemetics. We might have different approaches to it, but...
Right.
Even ancient Egypt itself had different dialects. People who lived in the Delta may have lived differently than people who lived, say, in Upper Egypt.
Oh, definitely they did.
There's a line.
No doubt about it.
There was a line, I think, in Sinuhe where he mentions that his speech was as confused as a bowman trying to speak to someone from Elephantine or something like that. Basically saying, hey, these two different parts of Egypt, they can barely even understand each other. And I see that in the Kemetic community as well. And I think of us as a virtual Kemet, with our settlements at various different points upon the virtual Nile. And some of us are more closer together, and some of us are further apart, and that's okay.
Yes, and I agree. I think you said it beautifully. You said it very beautifully. It is like a person from the marshes talking to someone from Elephantine Island, way in the south of Egypt. So we're talking about Aswan versus way up next to Alexandria. Those people spoke probably pretty different dialects if they were not educated priests or bureaucrats. Bureaucrats did the traditional Egyptian. They did Middle Egyptian, and they would write in that kind of literary style. Even later Egyptian has literary styles. But people who lived on the country, it's still true today if you go to Egypt. People in southern Egypt speak very differently from the north.
Yeah, there's a difference of geography and of culture. So
geography. The dialect is totally different. The consonants they almost switch in totally different ways between Cairo and Luxor. It's different.
So, wrapping things up, where do you see the temple going in the next 5 to 10 years?
Continuing to meet, continuing to serve the gods. That's the most important thing.
Yeah, I see the same thing.
And Kemeticism more broadly?
I hope I can express that in terms of hopes. I hope it deepens more and broadens more. I hope that we can get some of these messages back into the general community about some of the richness and of Egyptian thought and some of its really valuable things that it could bring to bear on the world's problems. And not just by doing ritual, but just by thinking about things in kind of a different way.
I think the philosophy of Ma'at, if taught in a college philosophy course, would be very helpful.
Yes, and also the kind of thought that is not a monotonic bistable logic. This is if X, then Y logic.
Yep.
That kind of logic is actually a logic that is immutable across time. It cannot learn. And it's a yes or no logic. It's bistable. It's either true or it's false. Egyptians did not think this way about the world.
I've heard the term polyvalent logic.
It's polyvalent in a way. It's polycentric in a lot of ways. And it's a way that they built the world differently than thinking of it, than building it in terms of truth and falseness. They were pragmatic people. They built the world in terms of what worked, what was conducive to Ma'at, what worked in society, what worked for the gods, what worked for the families. Were they perfect? No, of course they weren't perfect. But trying to unbind our ways of thinking from it's either my way or the highway is something I think that Egypt could teach us. And sacralizing the world, that would be my last one.
Okay. So my last question then, if somebody was new to Kemeticism or interested in Kemeticism, what reading or resources or online resources would you recommend? Where should people look?
Ooh. Well, there are several classic books. That's a tough one because it's going to take more than just saying 2 titles. It's not going to be 2 titles. Unfortunately, almost every book you're going to read, you're going to have a little bit of take this part with a grain of salt, and this part has got some really good stuff to it. Eric Hornung is good, but sometimes he gets a little too henotheistic in my mind. But he gets some of the spirit right.
His conceptions of the one and the many.
The one and the many,
correct.
It has some great stuff in it. It also has some stuff that you might not want to take as, again, in terms of it's completely true or completely false. Think about it in a more amorphous or nuanced way. Rich used to always recommend Jeremy Nadler's book, Temple of the Cosmos, which tries to get you into the mindset of Egypt as well. I have some nits to pick with it because you can't tell what he made up and what is actually coming from sources. But outside of that, it is a good way for people to get a sense. Geraldine Pinch, Egyptian Mythology, is an extremely good picture of Egyptian mythology that does give you some of the complexity of the mythology, the way the myths creatively overlap and blend in with each other and separate out with each other. all that's important to the ritual texts.
There is a class of literature called wisdom literature, which includes such things as the maxims of Ptahhotep, which are very popular, the declarations of innocence. These are basically, they're not holy writ, but they are instructions that are written often in the form of a father writing to a son to say, here is how you live a noble life in Ma'at. And it's very specific in many places to tell you exactly how to work in social situations, religious situations, political situations. There's some really good advice in there. There's some advice that's a little outdated in there. But I would recommend reading through as much of that as you can find. And you can find a lot of it in literature anthologies, such as Lichtheim?
Lichtheim. Her books are good. There's 3 of them. And there's Simpson, I think. There's a nice... and it's actually by several authors. There's more than one author contributing to, it's like a 2.5, 3 inch thick book of Egyptian literature. And you will see a lot of gold in there. Some of it's religious and some of it's wisdom or teaching literature, and some of it is some of the stories that also contain nuggets of Ma'at in them, because they're often built around it.
It's called The Literature of Ancient Egypt, an anthology of stories, instructions, stela, and autobiographies and poetry by William Kelly Simpson and...
Yes, that's it.
Robert Rittner.
Yes.
And Vincent Tobin.
Yes, that's it. That's a very good set of we use it in classwork now. So those translations are very good. I would recommend some of James Allen's writing. In his Egyptian grammar, he actually has a series of essays that are very instructive. And they will teach a person who is new to the topic about a lot of things. Like, okay, well, what was Egyptian literature? What did they talk about? What didn't they talk about? And the different cosmologies, or the main cosmogonies and cosmologies from the different regions of Egypt. And he talks about a lot of very useful things. And a person doesn't have to get into the grammar part. Just read the essays at each chapter, and you'll get a pretty good overview of the culture.
What's really interesting about your answers to this question was you didn't come back with primers for Kemeticism so much as primers for understanding Egypt and its mindset and philosophy, which is really fascinating to me, because that tells me that you're not thinking about Kemeticism in terms of Kemeticism itself. You're thinking about Kemeticism as how it relates to the ancient world and understanding ancient Egypt.
I suppose we do. It's our inspiration. It's the source from which we derive the truths that we are trying to live. Within it, maybe that could be said more articulately. I don't know, but it is true. We don't have a theology book of Kemeticism. There are pieces of that in a lot of modern Kemetic writers' work.
There's some of explanations of that in some of Richard's books.
In Rich's books, in Carrie Wisner's books, in Tamara Siuta's books, there's pieces of it, each of which has a slightly different viewpoint, which is great, and some of them more recent than others. But I think that for most people who are getting started, it's key to try to understand Egypt in Egyptian terms from these resources that we mentioned, instead of approaching it, as you kind of said earlier, from a ceremonial magician's standpoint, which is looking backwards and projecting onto the past, from European magical traditions, which were all constructed from this, and this is true, highly polyglot Egyptian / Jewish / Babylonian / Greek / several other things world that was happening especially in the early centuries CE in Egypt itself, in Alexandria, and in the Fayum areas of Egypt. But when we look backwards that way, we project too much, I think, and that's like a really key thing. It's better to let it bubble up from inside, and then you can interpret that stuff, and you can understand it in a better context. Don't apply it like, oh, Akhenaten was the precursor to monotheism.
Which he wasn't.
Because it's not really true, and you're back propagating something. The only significance of Akhenaten is Judaism. And if Judaism didn't exist in Akhenatens, it would be a very different kind of story you would tell. And so we're trying not to back propagate, trying not to think that the mythologies of Isis and Osiris and the way Egyptian religion worked are only true in terms of what Herodotus said and Diodorus Siculus said and a few of the other classical writers. Some of them had their own, axes to grind. I mean, Herodotus was writing kind of glitzy National Geographic of his time. He was trying to be a little sensationalistic. And yeah, he got a lot of stuff really right. But he also probably was having his legs pulled a little bit, and he was also probably saying some things that just weren't true because they weren't really based on direct knowledge of the past that was being described.
What you're doing when you're coming into Kemeticism is you're stepping into a new worldview. And that is a very difficult thing to do because there are so many components of that worldview. What I found myself doing when I was first learning as a Kemetic was reading as many Egyptology books as I could, trying to stick towards more recent Egyptology, as opposed to, say, Budge or Breasted, who are they were very helpful for their time, but we're past that now. Gathering as many facts as I could until I gathered enough of them. I saturated my brain enough that they started to crystallize into a form. And once I had that form, once I had that structure, the new information I could come and I could hang it over here or place it over here. I know where this fits in this worldview. And then my worldview just expanded from that, which is also one of the reasons why I don't feel threatened if Egyptologists learn something new. To me, that doesn't break my crystal. It takes it to another level. It's like a revelation, almost like experiencing a mystery religion. You find that experience and it changes the way you look at things.
Yeah, I think that's really true.
So last thing then, if people are interested in finding out more, where can they find you, whether it be online or in the real world or whatever public face that you have for that?
Let's see. I will speak that we have kemetictemple.org. It's a website at which you can read a few. There's some material on the site, not a whole lot, and you can reach out through email to myself and to several other members of a representative from each of the geographic temples, and that's a great place to begin. We do answer our emails. It may take a little time, but we do get it done. I have a blog myself, which is rather more technically academic, called imperishablestars.com. And that's a place where I put my own fascination and interest, which is the sounds of the language itself as it sounded, and reconstructing that, which we'll never quite get there, but it's a fascinating topic and it's a lot of fun. But a person could reach me through that, and we could then communicate as well. Do you still have your blog?
I have a blog. It's an old LiveJournal blog called Journal of a Modern Kemetic. And I used it for a period of several years when I was exploring my faith as a Kemetic, and I used it as a sounding board with the community. I put up my experiences. I tried to field questions, frequently asked questions there as well. And you can go there and you can read some of the stuff that I've read. I don't really keep up with it anymore. But if you found anything on there that was interesting, or if you had any questions for me, you could go to the kemetictemple.org site and put in a request to speak to me, and it would be forwarded to me.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for agreeing to do this with me today and put yourselves out there into the world. I'm sure people will be very fascinated to hear about all that. So thank you again for joining me. And I'll do my sign off later. So that's that.
All right.
That's sadly all we have time for today, but be sure to check back in for new episodes which continue to explore manifestations of the ancient world in the modern, including interviews with a bevy of archaeologists and Egyptologists, Kemetics and Reconstructionists, and key players in historical entertainment, including authors, filmmakers, actors, and game designers. If you like the show, please subscribe and rate it on your preferred platform and tell all your friends. I've been Dr. Harrison, and this was the Profane Egyptologist podcast. Thanks for listening.